I never thought I'd end up scrubbing floors in a penthouse that costs more than most people make in a lifetime. But here I am, 6 months later, still trying to figure out how everything went sideways so fast. It started when Dude's auto repair shop finally gave up the ghost. 23 years he'd been fixing cars in that cramped garage on Elm Street, and one day the landlord just decided he wanted to turn it into another coffee shop. Dad fought it for months, but the legal fees ate through what little savings we had left. Then Mom got sick. The doctor said it was nothing serious at first, just some tests to be safe. But you know how these things go. One test led to another, then specialists, then treatments that insurance barely covered. The bills started piling up on our kitchen table like snow in January, and suddenly we were drowning. I was halfway through my junior year at community college, studying business administration and working weekends at the diner. It wasn't glamorous, but I had plans. Maybe transfer to a 4-year school, get my degree, help Dad rebuild the shop someday. Lucas was still in high school then, captain of the debate team, and talking about scholarships. Smart kid, way smarter than me. That's when Mrs. Peterson from down the street mentioned her cousin knew someone who needed help. Victor Hayes, she said. Big shot businessman who lived in one of those glass towers downtown. Good money, she promised, and housing included. I remember the day I first walked into his penthouse. The elevator ride seemed to last forever, climbing higher and higher until my ears popped. When those doors opened, I stepped into something from a magazine. Floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the whole city, marble everything. Art on the walls that probably cost more than our house. Victor barely looked up from his laptop when the housekeeper showed me around. "You'll start at 6, she said, handing me a uniform that felt expensive even as work clothes. Mr. Hayes likes his coffee at 6:30, and the morning paper ironed flat. No wrinkles. The work wasn't hard, just endless. Dusting surfaces that never seemed to get dirty, polishing silver that gleamed whether it needed it or not, washing windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. Victor moved through his apartment like I wasn't there, which suited me fine. I sent most of my paycheck home every 2 weeks, keeping just enough for bus fare and the occasional sandwich. At first, everyone was grateful. Dad hugged me tighter when I visited on Sundays. Mom cried happy tears when the electricity stayed on. And Lucas seemed proud that his big sister was handling things. But gratitude has a shelf life, I learned. By winter, the atmosphere at home had changed. Dad started avoiding eye contact when I asked about job interviews. Mom fussed over me like I was made of glass, asking if I was eating enough, sleeping enough, if that man was treating me well. And Lucas? Well, Lucas started looking at me like I'd betrayed something important. "You don't have to do this forever," Dad would say. But his voice carried doubt. "Just until we get back on our feet." The thing is, I wasn't sure what back on our feet even meant anymore. The shop was gone. Mom's treatments were ongoing. And college felt like something that happened to other people. I started waking up in my tiny room above Victor's garage, staring at the ceiling and wondering if this was temporary, or if I'd just been telling myself that to make it bearable. Lucas was the worst part. Every Sunday when I came home, he'd find new ways to make his disappointment clear. He'd talk about his friends' older siblings who were in college, who were traveling, who were doing something with their lives. He never said it directly, but I could read between the lines. His sister was just the help now. The house felt different too. Conversations stopped when I walked into rooms. Dad's friends didn't come around as much. Even the neighbors seemed to look at us differently, like poverty was contagious and I was patient zero. Spring came early that year, and with it, the strangest request I'd ever gotten from Victor. I was reorganizing his walk-in closet, trying not to think about how his shoe collection was worth more than my family's yearly income, when he appeared in the doorway. "Saturday," he said, without preamble, the way he always talked to me, like I was supposed to read his mind. "You have an appointment." I looked up from the Italian leather boots I was arranging. "Sir? Salon. 2 o'clock. They'll take care of everything." He handed me a card with gold lettering that I couldn't even pronounce. "Important clients flying in from London and Frankfurt. I need the household to look appropriate." The way he said appropriate made my skin crawl. I was part of the furniture to him, something to be polished up when company came over. But I nodded anyway because arguing with Victor Hayes wasn't in my job description. Saturday morning, I took the bus across town feeling like I was heading to my execution. The salon was in one of those neighborhoods where even the fire hydrants looked expensive. Everything smelled like lavender and money, and the receptionist looked me up and down like she was trying to figure out what I was doing there. "You must be from Mr. Hayes," she said finally, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Right this way." What happened next still feels like something that happened to someone else. 3 hours of strangers poking and prodding, washing and cutting and painting. They attacked my hair first, taming the curls I'd inherited from Mom into something sleek and controlled. Then came the nails, filed into perfect crescents and painted a subtle pink that looked natural, but somehow better than natural. The makeup artist studied my face like she was planning a military campaign. "Good bones," she murmured, brushing colors across my cheeks and eyes that I couldn't have afforded with 6 months of salary. When she was done, I looked like myself, but sharper, more defined, like someone had adjusted the contrast on a photograph. The worst part was the dress. Victor's personal stylist had left it hanging in the salon's private room, navy blue and simple but clearly expensive. It fit like it had been made for me, which was impossible since I'd never been measured. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked confident, professional, like she belonged in penthouses and board meetings, like she'd never scrubbed a toilet or worried about electricity bills. The reflection was beautiful in a way that felt borrowed, like I was wearing someone else's life. All I could think about was Lucas. Our last fight had been about pride, about what we were willing to sacrifice to survive. He'd accused me of giving up, of choosing the easy way out instead of fighting like Dad always had. Looking at myself in that mirror, dressed up like some businessman's doll, I wondered if he was right. The ride back to the penthouse felt longer than usual. The driver kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, probably wondering who I was supposed to be. I caught my reflection in the window and flinched. The woman looking back at me belonged in Victor's world, but I wasn't sure where that left the girl who used to help Dad change oil and study for community college exams. When I walked through the penthouse doors, even Victor did a double take. He nodded approvingly, the way someone might nod at a successful home renovation. "Much better," he said, and somehow that felt worse than any insult. I spent the evening alone in my room, staring at myself in the small mirror above my dresser. The makeup was flawless, the hair still perfect, but underneath I felt like I was disappearing. Tomorrow, important men would look at me and see exactly what Victor wanted them to see. But what happened to who I actually was? I thought about calling home, but what would I say? That I'd spent the day being transformed into arm candy for a man who barely knew my name? That I looked beautiful and felt empty? That the money I was sending home was changing me in ways I hadn't expected? Instead, I sat there until the makeup started to feel heavy on my skin, wondering if this was what selling your soul looked like. Not dramatic or sudden, but gradual. One small compromise at a time until you woke up wearing someone else's face. Sunday evening brought rain that turned the city lights into watercolor smears against the penthouse windows. I'd been nervous all day, checking my reflection every few minutes like the salon's magic might wear off. By 6 o'clock, when the first guests arrived, my stomach was doing acrobatics. Victor's dining room had been transformed into something from a movie. Crystal glasses caught the chandelier light, silverware gleamed against white tablecloths, and fresh orchids perfumed the air. I'd helped set everything up that morning, but seeing it filled with powerful people in expensive suits still took my breath away. Marcel Lefebvre was the first to notice me. He was Victor's lead investor, a silver-haired Frenchman with kind eyes and an accent that made everything sound important. When I offered him champagne from the silver tray, he smiled and said something about how Victor had excellent taste in everything. The compliment felt strange, like it wasn't quite meant for me. Mrs. O'Connor from the advisory board was less subtle. She watched me move around the room with the focus of someone studying a particularly interesting specimen. When I refilled her water glass, she asked about my background, my education, whether I'd always been in hospitality. The way she said it made clear she knew exactly what my job really was. But it was the German contingent that made everything awkward. 3 men in matching dark suits who spoke in hushed tones and kept glancing my way. Every time I approached their corner of the room, conversation would stop. Not in a creepy way, just curious, like they were trying to solve a puzzle. I caught Victor watching all of this with growing tension in his jaw. This wasn't what he'd planned. He'd wanted me to blend into the background, to be attractive but invisible. Instead, I'd become the most interesting thing in the room, and that was clearly a problem. The dinner itself was a performance I wasn't sure I understood. Talk about market projections and regulatory frameworks. Handshakes that seemed to carry the weight of millions. I served courses that probably cost more than most people's weekly groceries, smiled politely when spoken to, and tried not to trip over my borrowed heels. But I could feel their attention, like heat from a fire. Marcel complimented the wine selection and asked if I'd chosen it. Mrs. O'Connor wanted to know about the flowers, where I'd learned to arrange them so beautifully. The Germans asked about my thoughts on American business culture, as if my opinion actually mattered. Each question, each compliment, each curious glance felt like stepping further away from who I really was. They saw someone poised and elegant, someone who belonged in their world. They had no idea I'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment where we sometimes ate cereal for dinner because it was cheaper than cooking. Victor's discomfort grew with each interaction. During the main course, when Marcel laughed at something I'd said about the weather, Victor's fork clicked against his plate hard enough to make heads turn. He was losing control of his own narrative, and in his world, control was everything. The worst moment came during dessert. One of the German investors, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses, asked me directly about my career goals. He said his company was always looking for bright young people with fresh perspectives. Before I could answer, Victor cleared his throat and smoothly redirected the conversation back to quarterly projections. But the damage was done. Everyone at that table had seen Victor's discomfort, had witnessed him pulling my strings like I was a marionette. The investor looked embarrassed. Mrs. O'Connor raised an eyebrow, and Marcel's kind smile turned slightly cold. When the evening ended with signed contracts and satisfied handshakes, I felt like I'd been turned inside out. Victor had gotten what he wanted. The deal was done, but something had shifted. The guests looked at me differently as they left, with a mixture of sympathy and respect that made my chest tight. I retreated to the kitchen while Victor saw everyone out, my hands shaking as I loaded the dishwasher. Through the service corridor, I could hear him on the phone, his voice sharp with frustration. He was already planning damage control, probably worried that his business partners would think less of him for how he'd treated me. Standing there in my beautiful borrowed dress, surrounded by dirty dishes and the lingering smell of expensive perfume, I realized something had changed in me too. For 3 hours, I'd been seen as someone worth listening to, someone with value beyond my ability to polish silver and stay invisible. It felt dangerous and thrilling and wrong all at once. Like I'd accidentally stepped into someone else's life and found it fit better than my own. Monday morning hit like a slap of cold water. I was back in my regular uniform, hair pulled into a simple ponytail, makeup scrubbed away until I looked like myself again. But Victor's mood had shifted overnight, turning sharp and unpredictable. He cornered me in the butler's pantry while I was organizing the wine inventory, his presence filling the small space like smoke. "We need to talk," he said, and something in his voice made my stomach drop. "About last night?" I kept my eyes on the wine labels, hoping I sounded calmer than I felt. "About your behavior." The words came out clipped, controlled. "The way you interacted with my associates. I need to know if you encourage their attention." I looked up at him then, confused. Encouraged what? I answered their questions. I was polite. Polite? He repeated the word like it tasted bad. "Marcel Lefebvre asked for your contact information. Did you give it to him?" "No, of course not." The accusation stung more than it should have. "Mr. Hayes, I did exactly what you asked. I was presentable. I served dinner. I didn't do anything wrong." But his eyes searched my face like he was looking for lies, for some hidden agenda I might be harboring. It hit me then that Victor wasn't angry about what I'd done. He was scared of what I might do. Scared that I might have realized my own worth during those 3 hours of being treated like an actual person. "Just remember," he said finally, straightening his tie, "you work for me, not for them." not for anyone else. The conversation left me shaky and confused. I spent the rest of the morning polishing silver that already gleamed, trying to make sense of what had just happened. By afternoon, I'd convinced myself it would blow over. Victor was just protecting his business relationships. It had nothing to do with me personally. Then Tuesday brought the photos. I was getting ready to leave for Mom's birthday dinner when my phone buzzed with a text from Lucas. No words, just a link to some gossip website I'd never heard of. The headline made my blood freeze. Mystery woman steals show at Hayes Industries merger dinner. There I was, caught in profile as I offered Marcel Lefebvre a glass of wine. The photographer had gotten me at the perfect angle, the chandelier light catching my hair, that borrowed dress making me look like I belonged in that world. The caption was worse. Sources say the unidentified woman charmed European investors and may have influenced the final deal terms. I called Lucas immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. Then I tried Dad, same thing. By the time I got to our apartment that evening, carrying Mom's birthday flowers and a cake from the expensive bakery near Victor's building, I knew I was walking into a war zone. Lucas met me at the door with his arms crossed, and that look on his face I remembered from when we were kids, and he'd caught me breaking something. "So this is what you've been doing," he said, holding up his phone with the article displayed. "It's not what it looks like." The words sounded hollow, even to me. "Really? Because it looks like you're playing dress-up with rich people while we're down here scraping by." Mom appeared in the doorway, looking frailer than usual but trying to smile. "Come on, you two, it's my birthday. Can we have one nice evening?" But Lucas wasn't done. He followed me into the kitchen, his voice getting louder. "Do you see how they're talking about you online? They're calling you his mistress, Emma, his kept woman. That's not true." I set the cake down harder than I meant to. The flowers scattered across the table. "I'm his housekeeper. That dinner was work." "Work?" Lucas laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Looking like that? Talking to millionaires like you're one of them? That's not work. That's performance." Dad tried to intervene, but Lucas was just getting started. He'd been holding this in for months, and now it was all pouring out. How embarrassed he was when his classmates saw the article. How his girlfriend's parents were asking questions. How he couldn't even tell people what his sister did for work anymore. "You think you're helping us," he said, his voice cracking. "But you're just making everything worse. We used to be poor but proud. Now we're just poor and pathetic, living off money from whatever this is." I wanted to fight back, to explain that everything I'd done was for them, that I'd given up college, given up my own dreams, to keep our family afloat. But looking around our tiny kitchen, at Mom's worried face and Dad's defeated shoulders, I realized Lucas might be right about one thing. The money had helped with bills, but it hadn't fixed anything else. "I'm trying my best," I said finally, but it sounded weak. "Your best used to be studying business and helping Dad with the shop," Lucas shot back. "Now your best is playing Cinderella for some guy who treats you like furniture." The worst part was that he wasn't entirely wrong. Somewhere between the salon transformation and the dinner party attention, I had started to feel like I was playing a role, but it was a role that paid well, that kept the lights on and food on the table. Mom's birthday cake sat forgotten on the counter while we argued, candles still unlit. By the time I left that night, nothing had been resolved. Dad walked me to the bus stop, trying to smooth things over, but I could see the doubt in his eyes too. "Maybe it's time to think about something else," he said gently. "This job, it's changing you." I wanted to ask him what the alternative was. Mom's medical bills weren't going away. Lucas still needed to finish school. The rent still came due every month. But standing at the bus stop in the cold night air, I realized I didn't have any answers anymore. The weeks that followed felt like walking on thin ice, never sure when the ground might give way beneath me. Victor's attitude toward me had shifted in ways that were hard to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. He started giving me tasks that had nothing to do with housekeeping. "I need you to review these invitations," he'd say, handing me a stack of elegant cards for gallery openings and charity galas. "Tell me which ones are worth attending." Or he'd ask me to greet visitors while he finished phone calls, introducing me as his assistant, rather than letting them assume I was just the help. The pay increase came without explanation, just a bigger number on my direct deposit that made me stare at my phone screen for a full minute. When I mentioned it to Victor, he brushed it off like it was nothing. "You're taking on additional responsibilities," he said. "It's appropriate compensation." But appropriate for what exactly? I wasn't qualified to be anyone's assistant. I didn't have the education or experience for the tasks he was giving me. Yet somehow, I found myself researching art exhibitions, coordinating with caterers, even proofreading speeches for board meetings. It felt like playing house with someone else's life. The strangest part was how natural it felt. Maybe it was all those business classes I'd taken before dropping out, or maybe I'd inherited more of Dad's practical intelligence than I'd realized. But I was good at organizing, good at remembering details, good at making things run smoothly. Victor started relying on me for more than just keeping his apartment clean. At home, the extra money made a real difference. Mom's treatments became less of a financial crisis and more of a manageable expense. Dad started talking about maybe taking some business courses himself, thinking about what came next. Even Lucas seemed to relax a little when he realized his college applications wouldn't bankrupt us. But success came with its own problems. The better I got at Victor's world, the more foreign my own family began to feel. When I visited on Sundays, I caught myself explaining things they hadn't asked about, using vocabulary that felt pretentious in our small kitchen. I'd bring expensive takeout instead of Mom's cooking, thinking I was being helpful, but it just made everyone uncomfortable. "You don't have to do that," Mom said one evening, looking at the sushi I'd picked up from Victor's favorite restaurant. I made meatloaf, but I'd already lost my taste for meatloaf. Somewhere between wine tastings and art gallery openings, my palate had gotten snobby without me noticing. The realization made me feel sick. Lucas noticed the changes too, though he was less kind about pointing them out. "You talk different now," he said during one of our increasingly awkward family dinners. "Like you're trying to sound smarter than us." "I'm not trying to sound like anything," I protested. But even as I said it, I wondered if he was right. Had I started putting on airs without realizing it? The worst part was the loneliness. In Victor's world, I was still the help, no matter how many additional responsibilities he gave me. His friends and business associates might be polite to me now, but I wasn't one of them. I was useful, decorative, convenient, but not equal. And in my own world, I was becoming a stranger. My old friends from community college had moved on, either transferring to four-year schools or finding full-time jobs. The neighbors looked at me differently when I came home in clothes that cost more than they made in a week. Even at church, where I'd grown up, people seemed unsure how to talk to me anymore. I started spending more time alone in my room above Victor's garage, staring at the ceiling, and trying to figure out who I was becoming. The girl who used to dream about running her own business someday felt like someone I'd known in another life. This new version of me was more polished, more confident, but also more isolated. The breaking point came during a dinner party at Victor's penthouse. I was coordinating with the catering staff, making sure everything ran smoothly, when one of the guests mistook me for another socialite. She spent 20 minutes telling me about her charity work, assuming I moved in the same circles, before Victor appeared and subtly corrected her assumption. The woman's embarrassment was painful to watch, but not as painful as the look Victor gave me afterward. It was a reminder, gentle but firm, of exactly where I stood in his world. I was allowed to play the part when it suited him, but I needed to remember it was just a performance. That night, I called in sick for the first time since I'd started working for Victor. I took the bus home and spent the day helping Dad organize his tool shed, getting my hands dirty and remembering what it felt like to do simple, honest work. But even that felt different now, like I was visiting a museum of my former life. Mom found me sitting on the front steps that evening, still in my old jeans and one of Dad's work shirts. "You look more like yourself," she said, settling down beside me despite her arthritis. "I don't know who that is anymore," I admitted. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the neighbors' kids play in the street. "Your father and I, we never wanted you to sacrifice yourself for us," she said finally. "We wanted you to have opportunities, not obligations. But the money helps," she interrupted. "But it doesn't help if it costs you your soul." I knew she was right, but I also knew it wasn't that simple. The bills were still there, the responsibilities were still real, and walking away from Victor's world meant walking back into financial uncertainty. I was trapped between two versions of myself, neither of which felt completely real anymore. The end came with an offer that should have felt like winning the lottery. Victor called me into his study on a Thursday morning, looking more animated than I'd seen him in months. The merger had been finalized, he explained, and the European partners wanted to expand their operations. They needed someone to coordinate between the American and Swiss offices, someone who understood both the business culture and the personal dynamics. They specifically requested you, he said, sliding a contract across his mahogany desk. Cultural liaison, they're calling it. Apartment in Geneva, competitive salary, full benefits. I stared at the numbers on the page, trying to process what I was seeing. The salary was more than Dad had made in his best year at the shop. The benefits package was better than anything my family had ever had. It was everything I should have wanted. This is incredible, I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange to my own ears. You'd report directly to Marcel Lefebvre's team, Victor continued. 6-month initial contract with option to extend. They were impressed with your presentation at the dinner. There it was again, that word, presentation. Like I was a product being marketed rather than a person making choices. I took the contract home that night without signing it, telling Victor I needed time to think. But really, I needed to understand what thinking even meant anymore. For months, my decisions had been driven by necessity, by what my family needed rather than what I wanted. Now, faced with an opportunity that could change everything, I wasn't sure I knew how to want anything for myself. The apartment felt suffocating when I got back from Victor's, so I decided to go home unannounced. I needed to see my family with fresh eyes, to remember who I'd been before all of this started. The bus ride across town gave me time to think, watching familiar neighborhoods roll past the windows. This was my city. These were my people. But lately, I'd been seeing it all through Victor's eyes. The buildings looked shabbier. The people looked tired. Everything seemed smaller somehow. When had I started measuring my own world against his? I found my family in the kitchen, gathered around the table with takeout containers and homework spread between them. Lucas was helping Dad with some paperwork while Mom sorted pills into her weekly dispenser. It was such an ordinary scene, but it hit me like a physical blow. This was real. This was home. Everything else had been performance. Emma. Mom looked surprised but pleased. We weren't expecting you tonight. I sat down at the table, moving aside Lucas's textbooks to make room. The contract was still in my purse, but suddenly it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. How could I explain what I'd been offered without it sounding like I was bragging? How could I tell them I was thinking about moving to Switzerland when I'd barely figured out how to live in my own skin? I need to tell you something, I said, and then everything came pouring out. Not just about the job offer, but about the past few months. About feeling lost between two worlds. About not recognizing myself anymore. I told them about the loneliness, about the way Victor's friends looked at me, about how I'd started to believe I was worth more than I really was. Lucas listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him. Dad nodded along like he'd been expecting this conversation. Mom just held my hand and let me talk until there were no words left. So, what do you want to do? Dad asked finally. I don't know, I admitted. The money would solve so many problems. You could get better treatment, Mom. Lucas could go to any college he wants. We could buy back the shop, maybe. But, Mom prompted gently, but I don't think I'd survive it. Not as myself, anyway. I'd become whoever they needed me to be, and eventually I'd forget there was ever anyone else. Lucas surprised me by reaching across the table and squeezing my other hand. I've been an ass, he said. I was angry at the situation, not at you, but I took it out on you anyway. You weren't wrong, though, I said. I was losing myself. I am losing myself. So find yourself again, he said simply. Money's just money. You're my sister. That night, I sat at my childhood desk in my old bedroom, writing a letter to Victor on notebook paper. I thanked him for the opportunities, for showing me possibilities I'd never imagined, but I declined the Switzerland position. More than that, I gave my 2 weeks' notice. It felt terrifying and liberating at the same time. I was walking away from financial security, from a chance to live in Europe, from what most people would consider the opportunity of a lifetime. But I was walking toward something too, even if I wasn't sure what it was yet. The morning I handed Victor the letter, he read it twice before looking up at me. "This is a mistake," he said. "You'll regret this." Maybe he was right. Maybe in 5 years I'd look back and wonder what my life might have been if I'd taken the safe path, the profitable path. But sitting in my family's kitchen that night, eating Mom's meatloaf and arguing with Lucas about basketball, I felt more like myself than I had in months. I was 21 years old, unemployed, and facing an uncertain future. But for the first time since Dad's shop closed, I felt like I was facing it as myself. Whatever came next, it would be my choice, my life, my story to write. The mirror finally showed me someone I recognized, someone I was willing to fight for. It was enough. It had to be enough.